Yay.
For those of you watching, thanks so much for joining us on Facebook tonight with Elly Griffiths. It is the launch day of The Lantern Men, the new Ruth Galloway book. So we are thrilled to be talking to her. For you unfamiliar with Elly Griffiths, I'll give you a quick bio of her. She is the author of the Ruth Galloway and Magic Men mystery series and the standalone novel, The Stranger Diaries, which I also have here. She is the recipient of the Edgar Award, the Mary Higgins Clark Award, and the CWA Dagger in the Library Award, which is a pretty incredible thing to be given how few recipients they have had for that one. We're expecting any day, maybe tomorrow, signed book plates for the Lantern Men. So if you're interested, feel free to order a copy. Anyone who orders any of Elly's books, we're going to go ahead and send a signed book plate along with that. So without much further ado, hi.
Hi, hello. It's lovely to be here.
Well, you know, we were just talking, one of the nice things about this whole situation, one of the few nice things is that we get to talk to people all over the world. So
Isn't it great? Suddenly yeah. The world's smaller. I'm at the top of my garden. It's 11 o'clock at night. Yeah. And here I am talking to you. So that's so nice. It's so lovely.
And I have been, today has been a major release day at the store. We've got about 4 or 5 really big, exciting books. And so I've been at work scrambling around like a crazy person, rearranging, and then flew home to get to talk to you. And we're going to be actually taking part in a Daniel Silva event in an hour and a half. So it's a busy day.
Fantastic. Oh, I love his books. That's wonderful.
Yeah. All right. So the world is pretty crazy right now. How are you?
Okay, I'm okay. You know, really, the world is crazy and so many people are having such a terrible time. So I have to say I'm not having a terrible time. It's you know, I'm here with my family, my husband and our 2 grown-up children who are sort of are at university, but they've come home for this period. Got my cat here. There's my cat, Gus. He's looking the wrong way. I hope he turns round. You know, and we live in Brighton, which is near the sea. And I work in a shed at the top of my garden. So really for me, life hasn't changed hugely. Though obviously I would normally be running around doing events. But, you know, I wake up, I do some yoga, I come up here to write, I go for a walk by the sea. So really, you know, I'm not having a terrible time. The UK is pretty bad and doesn't seem to quite know what it's doing, really. But I'm okay. What about you? What's it like there?
I mean, we're just better not talking about it.
Okay.
Houston is not in its best shape right now. We're having some pretty serious problems. And of course, I don't know that Texas knows what we're doing either. So we're doing the best we can though. So there's that, and all of my staff and all of my family are healthy. And so I really can't complain, you know.
Absolutely. And we've got books, haven't we? And books have become so important during this, haven't they? And bookstores like you are such a hub.
Yes, thank you. We have lots of great books, and I know everyone is thrilled to have a new installment of one of their very favorite series characters, Ruth Galloway. So before I get into talking about her, I do want to mention today's a little bit logistically complicated because we're busy at the store right now. John is in store working, but he will be texting me. I'm not being rude if I look at my phone. He will be texting me questions from the comments. So don't be shy, please. There will be time for those. Make sure you get us anything you want to ask Elly, because I know a lot of you have been readers of hers for a long time. So my first question is, I feel like people often fall in love with books and authors and series, not just for obviously the plotting or the writing, but because of the series character. Would you like to tell us a little bit about Ruth Galloway?
Yeah, I would, and it's been so lovely that people have reacted to Ruth. It's the best thing I think that can happen to a writer, really. Yeah, so Ruth is a forensic archaeologist. So she's an archaeologist who specializes in buried bodies and in helping the police when they find buried bodies. She lives on her own with her cats. cat, on a beautiful but deserted bit of the Norfolk coast, which is a very lovely part of England, but quite sort of desolate and flat, and beautiful, and but very isolated. She lives there, and she teaches at a university, and she's caught one day. She comes into work at the university, and there's a detective waiting for her, Detective Harry Nelson, and he needs her help because he's found what he thinks are a child's bones buried on the marshland. And Ruth goes in to investigate, but the bones actually turn out to be over 2,000 years old. But Ruth is drawn into the investigation and into what is now a very complicated relationship with the policeman, DCI Harry Nelson. So it's really lovely to see the book there in the background view, and here it is here. So now we're on book 12, which is The Lambton Men, and oh my goodness, life has got complicated, and Ruth and Nelson's relationships got complicated. And so at the very start, they have I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but I guess people will know that they have a child together, although Nelson is married. So Nelson is still married to Michelle, and they have children. But Ruth and Nelson now have a child together. And that child, unbelievably to me, is nearly 10 now. At the beginning of this book, Ruth has moved away, and she is living in Cambridge, and she has a new house, and she has a new partner. But that's just the beginning of the book.
Yes, excellent. So my next question is, what is happening with her and the Lambton Men? What is the investigation? What draws her back in?
Well, so Ruth has moved to Cambridge, although you'll be pleased to hear, I hope you'll be pleased to hear that her cottage in Norfolk is only rented out. So she hasn't burnt her bridges exactly. So she's living in Cambridge, and we're living with Frank, her new partner. But then it's not very long into this book. It's probably only about chapter 2 when the dark shape of DCI Nelson appears. And he has been working a very distressing case of a man who has now been convicted of murdering 2 women. But Nelson's pretty sure that the man has killed other women, but he won't say where they're buried. And suddenly this man, who is a very sort of charismatic, strange man called Ivor Marsh, says that he will tell Nelson where they're buried, but only if Ruth does the excavation. So Ruth is drawn into the investigation again, and kind of back into Nelson's life. And the title is The Lambton Men, comes from a really fun, spooky, well, I think it's fun anyhow, spooky legend, which is around Norfolk and Cambridgeshire and Suffolk, those sort of areas, of these sinister, dark, cloaked figures carrying lanterns that you see on marshland at night. And on marshland, and I know you have some similar land near you there, but sometimes on a marshland you see those little odd shaky lights. And these are said to be the Lambton Men. And you shouldn't follow them, because if you do, you are just, well, doomed, I'm afraid to say, doomed. But Ivor Marsh was part of an artist colony, and they called themselves the Lambton Men. So in both ways, the Lambton Men are sort of beckoning to Ruth in this book.
Great. So I would say that she is one of the most likable, relatable characters out there. And she's great. So in what ways, what was your inspiration for Ruth, and how many ways is she like you versus not like you?
Well, that's a really good question. I always say, and perhaps it's a bit irritating to say it, but I still always say it, that Ruth did suddenly just appear to me. What happened was I was walking with Andy, my husband, on marshland in Norfolk. We go to Norfolk a lot because my grandmother lived there, my aunt lives there. And Andy's an archaeologist, and he happened to say that prehistoric people thought marshland was sacred because it's neither land nor sea, but something in between. They saw it as a kind of link to the afterlife, neither land nor sea, neither life nor death, like a liminal zone, an in-between place. And that's why you find those bodies buried there sometimes, so-called bog bodies. And as soon as he said that, the entire plot of The Crossing Places, which is the first Ruth book, came into my head, and I did sort of see Ruth. And I teach creative writing, and I'd never let my students say this. I did sort of see her walking out of the mist, and I sort of felt I knew everything about her in that second. Where she'd been to school, where she'd been to college, what her favorite biscuit was, everything about her. But, of course, characters do come from somewhere, don't they? And I suppose I was quite conscious of wanting to write somebody who I felt was real. So Ruth is not terribly glamorous. She is, not terribly slim. She, you know, sometimes you do, and not so much now, but there was a time when you've got a lot of these sort of heroines of crime novels who ran 20 miles before breakfast, and then they cooked a 4-course meal. And Ruth kind of couldn't do that, you know, and she's very, very confident in her job. She's an archaeologist, but she's not very confident in her life. You know, she's not the sort of woman who knows how to tie a scarf, you know. So I wanted to write about someone like that, and she loves cats and Bruce Springsteen. As you say, my cat is there, and I do love Bruce Springsteen. You can't see it, but I actually have a poster of him in this little office. So in some ways she is like me in those ways, and I think it's quite useful if you're a writer to make a character who's like you in those little ways, really, because I don't have to ever look up a Bruce Springsteen a lyric, because they're all written on my heart, you know. But in other ways I don't think she's very like me, because she is very reserved and I'm not. You know, if somebody invites Ruth to a party, her first instinct is to refuse it, whereas I love parties. So in those ways, and the thing that I always notice is when I type the words, Ruth says nothing, which happens quite a bit, you know, that there's somebody says something and I say, Ruth says nothing, I always think, wow, you know, if somebody was writing about me, they would never say Elly says nothing. They would never say that, you know, it just wouldn't happen. So in some ways she's not like me, but you know, she comes from all sorts of places. I've got 2 older sisters who are both very sort of, you know, capable business people. So there's a bit of them in there, a bit of my aunt in there, a bit of various friends of mine, and you know, just a bit of all sorts of people, really. But she did. There was a sense also in which she did just suddenly appear.
That's wonderful. You know, Jacqueline Winspear tells a similar story and says the same thing. Like she was, I think, riding the bus one day, and all of a sudden Maisie Dobbs was there, fully formed, just that character. And it's not too often you hear that, but it is this lightning strike moment. And I think that a lot of it happens with characters that we just feel so connected to as readers, that are so fully formed. So it's just a magical moment. And I think also one of the reasons that it's so nice that Ruth is kind of quiet and would turn down the party. So many of us readers are pretty introverted, and so maybe we can sympathize.
Well, I think, you know, there are a lot of us out there who love cats and books, aren't there, and listening to the radio. And I suppose, although I did say that I love parties, I also love those things as well. So I think, you know, I think she has struck a chord with people, and it's lovely to hear that story about Maisie Dobbs, you know, because she's an amazing character.
Absolutely. So more about Ruth. So does she ever take the wheel from you in writing? Does she ever say, no, Elly, I'm not going to do that?
Sometimes she does, and I'm always slightly, because I write another series, the Brighton Mysteries as well, they're called now. I think you call them the Magic Men, which is a much better title for them. So, you know, when I'm writing about those characters, that's different. But whenever I start a Ruth book, I always think, oh, I just hope I can still get Ruth. And she always has sort of come to me, you know, when I need her to. But sometimes she does seem quite determined to do other things. You know, and again, this is something that I would probably say to my students, oh, you know, you're the writer, you're in charge, you make those decisions. But we all know that sometimes if a character sort of says to you, I want to do this, you probably ought to let them. I think you probably ought to let them. So there have been several times when Ruth just has, and also Cath Bad, who's another character in the books, who's a druid. He is the one probably of my characters who is most likely to just do something. And I think, but that's not what I need you to do here. But, you know, there he goes.
That's fascinating. Now, Ruth is a forensic archaeologist. You're several books into the series now. Do you still do research into that field? And do you have any funny stories or favorite tidbits you learned while doing research?
Well, it's so interesting, isn't it? And I love doing the research. And I think that is one of the things that I love when I read a crime novel myself, is learning new things. And so I love that when I'm doing the research. So yeah, my husband's an archaeologist, though I have to say he wouldn't mind me saying this, but he's not much help. He's no help at all. But you know, it's just, in fact, he hasn't read most of the books. You know, it's just not something that you know, they're not his sort of book, I don't think, and that's fine by me. But he has introduced me to a couple of archaeologists who have been super helpful. And one is a woman called Lindsay Harvey, who is an archaeologist and a bones expert. So she has been super helpful. And there's always something, you know, in every book. Obviously, you try and think of a little different way of doing it. And I'll ask Lindsay something, and she'll say something that you think, oh, and in this book, particularly Ruth doing it, an excavation in a garden where she thinks these bodies might be buried. And Lindsay said to me that when you see nettles, when you see a patch of nettles, it can mean that there's a dead body there. So everyone go and look in your gardens. But I mean, it's not as simple as that. It basically just means there's been some sort of human action. So, you know, without putting too fine a point on it, it could just be sort of human waste or something there. But if there are nettles, I think I could be wrong here, but I think she said that you couldn't have nettles without people. So that really makes me think, you know, when you look I look at my garden out there in the darkness, it's got quite a few nettles in it. So, you know, things like that I just think are so fascinating. Another thing I learned for The Dark Angel, which is book 10, was that you can sometimes see a tattoo on a bone. You can tell from a bone whether someone's been tattooed.
That is fascinating, yeah.
Isn't it? So there's always something that makes me think, oh, I like that. That's you know, that's a really interesting little thing, isn't it?
So mentioning other books in the series or any of your books, which we'll get around to some of your other books in a little bit, what has been your favorite book to write?
Oh gosh, that is such a hard question.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's a good question. And in some ways it is, which is quite a good thing. It is usually the one you're writing at the moment. So at the moment I'm writing book 13, which is called The Night Hawk. And I'm really enjoying that. And of course it has been an unusual experience, you know, writing in lockdown, writing in this world. And I was saying earlier on, I'm lucky in that my day-to-day life hasn't changed that much. But of course the world has changed. And you know, it has, I think this book, a lot of it is set in a very spooky farmhouse called Black Dog Farm. And I think maybe there might be a sort of sense of spookiness and claustrophobia about it that comes from this lockdown experience. But I do like that. And I've noticed in myself, the books that I love, you know, that I reread again and again, things like Secret History, or there's certain Georgette Hare books that I love, are often when people are sort of marooned together in a house. So because of that, I think two of my Ruth books that I really have enjoyed doing are The Ghost Fields and The House at Sea's End, because I do like that. I like it when people are sort of stuck together in a house. And of course, you can't do it too often as a writer. So you've got to pick your moments. So I think in The Ghost Field, it was because there genuinely were floods in Norfolk that year, and so they could be flooded and there's snow in the house at Sea's End. And there's another reason why in The Night Hawk they have to be sort of stuck in a house together. So yeah, so I do enjoy, I think those are probably the ones I really enjoy writing, when people are marooned together in a house. You know, I don't know if you're a Georgette Hare fan, but there's always a moment in a Georgette Hare book, where there often is, when they're all stuck in a little, you know, usually a little inn somewhere, and somebody comes galloping up with a coach and horses. Oh, I love all that.
It's such a classic construct, but I'm such a sucker for it too. Like, you give me any reason people are marooned in a house anywhere in the world and someone turns up dead, and I'm going to read that book.
Absolutely. It's a classic, really, isn't it? And on a boat or something, all those, you know, absolutely. Yeah. Bring them in on an island, and yeah.
Any closed cast and something starts going wrong, sign me up.
Absolutely, me too.
So there are some of you who have tuned in a few minutes late and you missed the beginning of this. I'm just going to interrupt to say that you can find all of our virtual author event videos on YouTube. Give us a few days to get them uploaded so you can see them in their entirety, or you can just wait until this is done, and Facebook will have the whole video available to watch from the beginning. No need to distress. You can see it later on. So let's see. P.D. James once said there were only 4 motives for murder: love, lust, loathing, or lucre. Do you have a favorite motive for your book?
Oh, what a good question. How clever that is, that alliteration as well. Love, lust, loathing, or lucre. Oh, well, I think Do you know, I think the strongest of those is still going to be love, really, in whatever way or in whatever distorted way it might come out. I think probably that is the one that is, you know, is the strongest and possibly my favorite to write about. But yes, and it quite often goes with lust as well. Possibly they all come together, don't they, in a beautiful sort of but it's true, really, isn't it? There's true, and whoever it was that said there are only 7 plots. You know, there are only so many plots and only so many motives, really. And one of the things that I find quite hard as a crime writer is that you do have to give a motive. And of course, in real life crime and true life crime, there often isn't at all, is there? Or one that we can't understand, or people just have these terrible impulses. But you can't really get away with terrible impulses in a crime novel. I mean, maybe you can, and maybe I've had a few of them in mind. But, you know, generally you do have to give a proper motive and think it through. And sometimes that is quite hard, isn't it, to do that? But I think the thing is that there might only be so many plots or so many crimes, but and we've talked about that a bit already. I think it's the characters that make the book different, you know, and it doesn't really matter if we have, you know, I could sit down with Anne Cleves, say, who's a lovely British writer who's always been very nice to me, and we could write the same plot, but Vera and Ruth are so different. It would be really different. So I think it probably is the characters that make it different, I think.
Yeah, I agree. So let's see. So now we're talking about plots. Here is essentially your typical plotter versus pantser question. But how much do you plan out the mystery plots in your books?
Well, I am probably a bit in the middle of that. I don't know if there is a word for a fancy plotter or something, but that's probably me. I do some plotting, and I sort of write, so I've got a little notebook, but here it is, here's my little notebook. Right at the front of it, I write down all the dates.
Wow.
So I can remember when people are born and when people died. And then I just write down like little notes, sort of chapter notes. I don't know if you can see that sort of. Don't think that's given anything away. In fact, that's these are the notes for the Postscript Murders, which is my next standalone. So I just do a little note for a few little notes for each chapter. But I do usually go to the end, and I do usually know who did it and sort of why. So it is plotted to that extent. But I know writers who will do massively long drafts and who have programs on the computer like Scrivener that does, you know, the plotting, and I'm in awe of those people. And I think it's great. Everyone should do, you know, use what they can. But I'm quite old school. I just write a few notes in a book, and actually for my last few books, I've noticed there are fewer notes. I haven't written, even to the small extent to which I did write things down. I've done it a bit less, but actually my last few plots, I would say the Lambton Men and the Stranger Diaries, my first standalone, have actually got very complicated plots. And somehow I have managed to hold that in my head. I don't know why, and I don't know if that will stay or if it was just for those particular books. But I probably am just in the middle of plotter and pantser. I like to leave myself a little bit of, I don't know what's going to happen, just to keep it interesting, you know, like there's a knock on the door and I'm not sure who it is. I do like that. I suppose what I think is it's a bit like it's kind of the difference between having a map, like a written out map. I love maps. I don't know about you, but having a map and having the sat nav on. Because if you have a map, you sort of know, don't you? But you might go off the road a little bit and you might come back. But with a sat nav, you have that voice saying, turn around where possible. You have gone, return to the route. That's another one that they say. So I try not to have the sat nav on. I try just to have a little map.
I get it. That's actually a good metaphor for it. So you mentioned Stranger Diaries, which I absolutely adored. It was my favorite book of last year, won the Edgar Award. I just can't rave enough about it. We've sold hundreds and hundreds of copies of Stranger Diaries. And it, for those of you who haven't read it, number one, what are you waiting for? And number two, it's a standalone. You should definitely dive in and give it a shot. But it has a little bit more of a Gothic feel, obviously, which the main character studies Gothic, like it's intentional and works well. Can you give us a bit of a rundown about Stranger Diaries as well, and maybe what your inspiration was for that book?
Oh, but first of all, McKenna, I should just say, you have been such a supporter of this book. You've been so amazing about it. From the beginning, you have been putting things on Instagram and things. So I'm so grateful to you. And I know I've never really expected it to do so well in the US and won the Edgar, which was absolutely one of the most thrilling moments of my life. Found out about it sitting here in the shed with Gus, and we were both delighted. Of course, I had expected to be at a lovely banquet, but even so, it was lovely. So yes, well, I did want to do something a bit different with this book, and I love Gothic fiction. I've got an MA in Victorian literature, and that's the sort of the books that I love. My favourite writer is Wilkie Collins, so I love that sort of book. But I was thinking for a while about how to do it, because I didn't really want to write a historical novel, you know, partly because there's so many good ones out there at the moment. People like Anna Mazzola and Laura Purcell writing really, really good sort of Victorian stuff. So I didn't want to do that. And I couldn't think of a way to do it. But then I sort of hit on two ideas. And one of them was to start with a made-up ghost story, but a ghost story that's meant to be Victorian. And there was a day, was it 2018, 2017? Well, remember that day? I don't know if you had it there, but when the sky went yellow because of some dust cloud. And I was actually meeting my editor. We met for lunch, and coming home, there was this weird light in the sky. And I hit upon the beginning of this ghost story, which was going to be very Gothic. And it was good. "If you'll forgive me," said the stranger, "why don't we pass the time with some storytelling?" Something like that. So that was how it was going to start. And then I realized I could also set it in the place where I teach creative writing. So I teach creative writing at Cambridge on an MST there, but also at a place called Westdean in Sussex. And it's a fascinating old place. It's an old stately home in the middle of the country. But it used to be owned by a man who was very involved with surrealist art. So it's this amazing... You must see it, McKenna. You would love it, because you know you've got these corridors that are all panelled and chandeliers and suits of armour, and then suddenly you see a Dali telephone or some sort of weird piece of art. I shouldn't say weird. My sister's a modern artist. You say, why is that weird? No, it's not weird. Some sort of beautiful, thought-provoking piece of art. And one of the strangenesses about the house is there's a spiral staircase that leads up to a study in the attics, and it was Edward James, the man who owned the house. That was his study. And in the carpet of the spiral staircase are these footprints embedded in it. And when James's wife died, he had her footprints put into this spiral staircase. And I suddenly thought, well, I'm certainly not saying there's anything spooky about their relationship, but I was thinking, my goodness, that is quite spooky, isn't it? And I could put that into the book, and I could make this. I wanted to set it in a modern day school, modern day comprehensive school, which, you know, in the UK means a school you don't have to pay for. The sort of school I went to, just an ordinary school. But it was a school that was in an old house. And I put that staircase in the school. So when I had the staircase, when I had this ghost story, then I had the idea for the book. And it starts with a teacher at the school dying, being murdered, and her death seems to echo the deaths in the short story. So that's kind of how it starts. But I have to say, I had so much fun writing it.
It shows, and we have told everyone it has a little bit of everything. Everything you want with between the Gothic feel, a book within a book, a really solid plot, likable characters, a little bit of you don't know what's happening. So it's all great. And watch it with the surrealist talk as I'm looking past my computer at a Dali etching. So
oh, wow. How funny.
I do have to come visit because I have a couple Dali pieces and would love to see that. Yeah.
And I was in Bouchercon, was it last year, the year before last, wasn't it, at St. Petersburg, and they had that amazing Dali museum there. It was just so incredible to go there, it really was. The other thing I wanted to put in the book was a diary, because I don't know, do you keep a diary?
I don't. I have at certain points in my life, honestly, been recommended by a therapist. but
you know, I've written so much since lockdown, so I probably, but I'm interested in people who keep diaries. I keep a diary, and I wanted to have a moment in the book where one of the main characters, Claire, keeps a diary when she finds that someone else has written in her diary. And because I just find that it does happen in one of my favorite books, The Woman in White, when Count Fosco finds Marion Halcomb's diary, and he not only reads it, he writes in it.
Yeah, it is so creepy, that moment in the book. It's so creepy. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Yeah. So that was another thing I sort of wanted to keep in the book. But yes, writing a diary, I mean, I do ask myself, why am I doing it? You know, I would hate them ever to see the light of day, but you do it for some reason, don't you?
Yeah. Oh, when I make a point to, or to journal, you know, it is very therapeutic, and it does help with sorting out whatever the day's issues are.
I think that's right. And I think you put them into for a start, you sort of put them into a consecutive order, don't you? Mm-hmm. And you sort of think them out. And yeah, so I do still find it very therapeutic. It's also very good for your ego to read back your old stuff, because, oh my God, you sound so terrible. Well, especially you read your teenage diaries. Mine are so pretentious and awful, but...
Well, the minutiae of the day that are so important on that day, when you look back, are clearly not at all.
I know, and huge events happen in the world, and you are so concerned with... I was very, very obsessed with Starsky and Hutch for a while, and I wrote about them a lot in my diary, and huge things happening in the world, but, you know, I felt the world would want to rehash my Starsky and Hutch plots, and I wrote my own versions as well, so...
Oh my gosh, original Starsky and Hutch fan fiction.
Well, yeah, do you know what? It was quite a big moment for me, because I used to write these little episodes of Starsky and Hutch, and I used to hand them around. People used to want to read them at school. My friends were sort of, I think a lot of us liked them. And you would call it fan fiction now. And people would sort of say, oh, have you got a new episode? So I would hand them out. And I remember one time I killed Starsky, which was terrible because he was my favorite. And I do remember that people cried. And I quite liked that, though. I quite liked that I could make them cry. So I think that was the first moment when I sort of thought, oh, you know, maybe I could do this. You know, maybe I sort of know how to do that.
That's amazing. That's a great story. You're building into this writing career. You've killed off a character, and you've loved that people enjoyed it.
I know, it's terrible, isn't it? My goodness, I should stop right now.
Okay, so for other things, not Stranger Diaries, Ruth Galloway, or Starsky and Hutch, you also have written a middle grade series, A Girl Called Justice, and John and I both have read these and love them. So you want to talk a little bit about Justice Jones?
Oh, thank you. I'm so pleased that you've read them. Wow. Yes, well, it was another case, really, where this time I was on a train going across Norfolk, and it's very flat, as we've agreed, and I suddenly thought of this character called Justice Jones, who was going to school for the first time and travelling in a taxi across marshland to the school, and I thought, well, I do want to write about her. And the book starts, actually, where Justice is in this taxi going... across Romney Marsh, which is in Essex, and she in Kent, actually, it's on the border. So driving along there, and she says to the taxi driver, do you come here often? And he says, no, but don't know I'm doing this voice, but anyhow, no, but my brother was here last week. And she says, oh, is he a taxi driver too? And he says, no, he's the undertaker. So there's been a death at the school. So I sort of had this first scene, and it was I was going to set it in about 1936. And then I realized that Justice really is my mum. Because my Justice is a singer brought up by her dad because her mum is dead. And her dad's a lawyer, and hence her interest in murder, really. But my mum was very similar, that she was brought up just by her dad, who was an actor. But he was a kind of traveling actor, so he traveled around the country, different places each week, and so she didn't really have a settled home, and she went to boarding school when she was about 10 or 11 and really didn't like it. But the character of my mum, that sort of feisty, determined, hating rules, all those things are there in Justice. So she really is, even though I didn't totally notice it, my mum. And there's a tiny little spooky thing, actually, because my mum was called Sheila Nan Laws, and she used to write stories. Obviously, where I've got any talent that I have is from my mum. And she used to write these stories, and she kept them, and they were so funny. They were kind of spy stories, because my mum, growing up in the war, imagined herself a spy, like a teen spy. You've never in your life met anyone worse at keeping secrets. She would have been a terrible spy. But anyhow, she thought she would have been a good spy. So she used to write these stories, and she took part of her name. And so she called this character Nan Laws. And when I saw the illustration of Justice that you held up there, I liked it so much because it seemed to have everything in it. She was feisty, she was bold, but she was also quite funny. Yes, isn't it lovely? Yeah. And I said to my editor, I'd really like to write a little letter to the artist to say thank you. And I just said, that's a really nice idea. She said, yeah, she's a young woman, American woman. She's called Nan Lawson.
That is spooky. I just got goosebumps.
I know, isn't it? And I think, I don't know, but I think Nan's quite an unusual name for a young woman to have.
Yes,
and you know, isn't that incredible? So yeah, that was quite a nice moment. But I've written a couple of them now, and again, I just really love doing it. So.
Well, we love them, and for those of you who think you don't need to read a book originally written for children, you do. The plot is great. The character is great. There's nothing juvenile about them except that they're appropriate for that age group. So again, you've got big fans in me and John who are definitely not little in any way.
Oh, that's lovely. And I do hope they would appeal to anyone who just likes a good murder mystery. And they're snowed in. We were saying earlier on, they're snowed in the school. So what more could you want?
I mean, I told you, anything with that plot, I'm going to read
it. Me too, absolutely, yeah.
All right, I do have a couple of questions. I haven't actually been reading them because I've been so engaged chatting with you, but let's see. We have from Andrea. Did you have a plan, or do Ruth and Nelson lead the way? I think I kind of touched on this, but maybe the overall storyline.
Yeah, at first, Andrea, I didn't have a plan at all, and I thought I would have some sort of romance between them because they're so different, and I thought that would be interesting. But I had not really, I suppose, planned for there to be so many books. And so the good thing about the challenging thing, but also the good thing about writing a long series is you have to kind of do what comes next. You know, I wrote standalones at first, and then you can just stop, can't you? At a certain point, like say, for example, someone gets pregnant and you can just stop it there. But if you're writing a series, they have to have the baby and then the child has to grow up, and at every stage there are complications. So I'd not really planned ahead. And up till now, I hadn't thought how it might end. But now I'm on writing book 13, I do have a bit of an idea about how I'd like it to end, even if it's just a pause. But I have thought a little bit about how it might end.
Speaking of that, Marjorie asks, are you planning more in this series?
Oh yes, Marjorie, I am. I'm writing book 13 at the moment. It's called the Nighthawk, and there will definitely be a 14. I mean, beyond that, I haven't planned, but not to say that will be the end. But so there will definitely be some more, yeah. I haven't finished with them yet.
So Laura asks, why did you choose to set Now You See Them 10 years later, and have you thought to do something with Ruth? And since she's asking about the Magic series, maybe you can talk a little bit about it as well.
Okay, well, thank you for that question. Yeah, so the Magic Men series is about a couple of old sort of comrades from the war. The first book is called The Zigzag Girl, and it starts in 1950. And it starts when the body of a woman cut into three is found in Brighton, which sounds awful and ghastly, but I have to promise everyone that my books aren't gory, really, even though it's an awful gory thing. But it reminds the policeman of a magic trick. And you know that trick where there's a woman, and I'm afraid it almost always is a woman, who goes into the cabinet, and then the magician puts the swords through and they pull out the middle bit, and that's called the Zigzag Girl because it makes that shape. So it reminds the detective Edgar Stevens of somebody he served with in the war who was a magician called Max Mephisto, and they solve that case together. So there are, at the moment, 5 books in the series, but yes, for the 5th one, which is called Now You See Them, it moves on 10 years from the book before. So book 4 was The Vanishing Box, which is 1953, and then we've got up to 1964. The main reason was, which you would, I think I'm trying not to give too many spoilers away, but there's a bit of a conclusion in The Vanishing Box, and I didn't want to start with that happy ending, really. I wanted 11 years to have gone by, and whilst the couple in question are still happy, things are more complicated. It's that complication thing again. So I wanted there to have been that whole period of time where things kind of happened and got complicated. Also, the 60s, a very interesting time to write about. And this book is set in 1964 in Brighton. And so if you say 1964 to anyone who lives in Brighton, they immediately say mods and rockers, because that was when there was a big fight on the seafront between the mods, you know, the sharp-suited young guys with the scooters, and the rockers with the leather jackets and the rock music. And there was an absolute sort of pitched battle on the beaches of Brighton. So I wanted that to be the backdrop of this book, but also wanted to write about the 60s. I think the 60s are very interesting because I was born in 63, so I don't really remember them hugely, although I have older sisters who were quite swinging, so they tell me anyhow. But actually, for a lot of women, life still was not very, very liberated, you know, and I found out in the course of writing these books that police women, for example, as they were called then, couldn't drive police cars until the 70s. In England, you know, so we think of the 60s as quite a, you know, beginning of sort of maybe women's liberation. Watching, by the way, watching Mrs. America at the moment, so interesting. Wow, that period of history, so interesting. But, you know, they weren't that liberated. And for example, women were expected often to give up work when they married. My mum did, you know, and that's what I wanted to write about. So there are a couple of reasons there why. And just to say, there will be other books in that series, so I'm going to carry on with them. And if you've read Now You See Them, you'll know that a couple of women have come to the forefront of the books, and the books are going to be very much about them as well as about Max and Edgar.
Great. So you mentioned that you were in the area at the top of your garden. This is where you write. What does a normal writing day look like for you, either pre-COVID or now during? Is it the same? You still writing? Have there been changes? And what's your schedule like?
Well, do you know, I suppose the thing about this strange and odd and surreal and awful time really that we're in is that for some lucky people like me who are at home and can work at home, there is a routine really now that I tried to have whenever I was at home, but I did travel a lot. Last year, I did 63 events, you know, and went abroad a few times, and I love doing that because I love meeting readers, but I love meeting you all here tonight. But, you know, being at home does mean that you can have more of a routine. So normally I get up, I've been getting up later and later actually in lockdown. I don't know if that's a thing. But I would get up sort of about 7:30, 8, and then I have breakfast and I come up to my shed at the top of the garden to start to work. I've got a cat. I'm just going to move the things so you can see him. Thus. And at about 8:30 every morning, he comes up and he waits by the shed door. He's like my little writing conscience, you know, so I have to follow him up. So then I try and write every day. I write at least 1,000 words a day. That's my kind of mantra. And I stop, and since lockdown, I'm one of those yoga converts in lockdown. I did it a bit before, but now I do it every day at 11:30. I pick 11:30 is because that's when the kids get up, so we do that together. And then we maybe have a little bit of lunch, and I do some more in the afternoon, and I try and go for a walk every day. And I swim quite a lot. I swim in the sea. I'm really lucky because I'm really near the sea. I can see it, just the top of it from my shed. And I live just outside Brighton, Brighton's obviously a very busy sort of town. Even now it's busy, but it's a little quieter where I live, and there's some nice beaches where you can swim. So I do that, and then I come back, and I usually finish work sort of by about 5 or 6, and I don't usually, unless I've got a big deadline, do stuff in the evening. So Yeah, so I do have a routine and I do try and stick to it. And that has been, but one of the funny things, I don't know, a lot of my other writer friends have said the same thing, is really in these last 3 months, I've had nothing to do but write. I haven't had any events to go to. I am teaching still, but on Zoom, it's a lot easier in some ways. But I'm not much further ahead with my book. Sorry, I'm sure my publisher's watching. It's all fine, publishers. It's all fine. But I would have expected to be a lot further ahead. So maybe it's just taking me longer. I don't know.
At least you're writing. We're either finding that people are generally more productive when I ask that question because there's nothing else going on. There's no social activities. They're just at home writing. Or their routines are completely destroyed because children are at home instead of at school.
Well, so. I absolutely, I do think, goodness, if you are homeschooling in this time, you absolutely have so much of my respect and sympathy, because I would have found that very hard. My children are grown up, they're 22, they're both at university, but they've both sort of come home for this period. So one's studying music, the other one's studying zoology, so they're twins, but obviously very different interests. But I don't have to, luckily, I don't know anything about music or zoology, and they wouldn't want my help anyhow. So, so I haven't had that at all. But it is funny, I think at first, because everything was so scary and so strange, it was quite hard to write and lose yourself. And I did this thing where I read The Crossing Places aloud on my Facebook page every day. And I did find that really sort of reassuring to read and have that connection with readers. But then, as I got into the routine, I had a deadline, I had to write, and it did come to me. But as we said earlier, it's possible that the book itself, is a product of its time, and there's possibly a certain sort of intensity to it that comes from this time.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to read it. So here's a 3-part reading question. I'm happy to repeat any of it whenever.
Okay, I'll concentrate.
All right. So who are some of your writing influences? Who are some of your favorite authors? And what have you read and loved recently?
Oh, okay. Wow. Those are all really, really good questions. So I think I am quite influenced by, I said about him earlier, Wilkie Collins is my favourite writer of all time, really, Victorian novelist, and I just love those sort of books. And I think particularly in The Moonstone, the way Wilkie Collins writes about the shivering sands and that whole sense of a whole landscape being in a way sort of significant and doomed, that has really influenced me. And I think you can see that in the way I hope you can, really, in the way that I just described Norfolk. So I think I'm particularly influenced in those books, and we talked about the influence of Gothic writers like Daphne du Maurier, and House on the Strand is another favourite. Those sort of books I think have influenced me. Probably Agatha Christie as well, and some of those Golden Age writers, Barbara Vine. Writers that I enjoy reading, well, all those, but I also enjoy lots and lots of modern current crime writers. Amy Stewart, the Miss Copp sisters, love those books. Leslie Thompson, who I don't know, I think you do get her, the Detective's Daughter series. I love those.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're really excellent. Anne Cleeves, Kate Atkinson, I really, really like. Non-crime, I'm a huge Anne Tyler fan, also Alison Lurie. I love Alison Lurie's books. I've been rereading them actually in lockdown, and really, really loved rereading Imaginary Friends. That one where they think they're in touch with outer space. Something about that has really really resonated with me in this time. So lots of writers that I really love. William Shaw, who writes a really good series set in the 60s actually, in Rankin. Yeah, so many of them. Mick Herron, who writes great sort of spy stories. I really like those. So what have I read recently that's great? Well, actually, I read William Shaw's latest, is called Gravesend. And it's a brilliant book in lots of ways. Have you read it?
I have not.
It's the only crime novel I've ever read that part of it is from the point of view of a badger. I'll say no more. But you remember we said about wanting to learn things from books. You learn a lot about badgers, but it's also a really, really good crime novel. And also Leslie Thompson has just written a standalone called Death of a Mermaid. And that's really, really good as well.
Excellent. Well, before we got on this live, you mentioned your night vision goggles and seeing badgers in the garden. So now you can imagine what they're thinking.
Yes, I can. And it was so interesting. Poor William, though, because, yes, so I was just saying earlier on that one of our obsessions in lockdown has been this night vision camera. So my daughter's a zoologist, so she's very interested in this as well. But we have this footage of badgers and foxes in our garden, and I keep sending them to poor William Shaw, and he's probably thinking, I'm not really that interested. I just wrote a book about them, but William lives in Brighton and we're good friends, so he has to put up with my badger pictures. So yes, so interesting. Because another thing that I found out actually is that archaeologists quite often look into badger sets because badgers have their sets for hundreds of years in the same space. So there's
wow.
Archaeological, yeah, the things you learn from crime novel. I've also just read Magpie Lane by Lucy Atkins. I really loved that. That was really good.
Oh, wonderful.
Set in Oxford, creepy house, all the things we like. You'd love it.
Okay, great. What's it called again?
Magpie Lane.
Magpie Lane. I'll have to make sure to check that one out. I haven't seen it quite yet. Okay, so that is the end. We don't have, I just checked with John, we don't have questions, but on my solo interviews, I like to do a few questions from the Proust questionnaire, not horribly terrible ones. For those of you who don't know, Marcel Proust came up with this group of questions in the late 1800s, and it's a whole set of questions to essentially get to know a person better. So this is about getting to know you. What is your most prized possession? And I always qualify this as something inanimate, not your cat or children.
Oh, well, I have my dad's violin, which is a pretty prized possession. We were chatting earlier about music, and my son studying music is a really good pianist, actually plays the violin as well. But I'm not very good, but I do have his violin, which was rather a nice one. And he was Italian, and he played the violin really well. So I think that is a very prized possession of mine.
That's great. I have my grandfather played fiddle because, you know, we're here in Texas, and he wasn't classically trained, but I have his fiddle in a case that my great uncle made for him, a wooden case. So it would definitely go in prized possession territory.
Oh, that's really lovely because they've got both their sort of spirits there, and that's lovely.
Yeah, it's not the one I play, but I have it. What is the trait you most admire in a person?
Oh, what's the trait I most admire in a person? Kindness, I think. I admire people who are kind, and also people who are brave, and it sometimes goes together, I think.
Yeah, I think kindness is a wonderful catch-all answer, because I feel like if someone's kind, then whatever they're doing is going to be well-intentioned.
Yes, and I hope that, you hope that if you hope that that's the one thing that you can try and be, don't you?
Yeah. Which talent would you most like to have?
Oh, well, I would like to be able to play that violin, I tell you, but I'd also love to be able to sing. You see, I'm half Italian and half Welsh, so my real name's Domenica De Rosa, as you know, but I write as Elly Griffiths, which is my grandmother's name, and it's a Welsh name. Half Italian and half Welsh. I should be singing like a blinking nightingale, shouldn't I? I should be so good at it, but I really can't sing, and I'd love to be able to. So yeah, I'd like to be able to sing.
Fair enough. So before I close with my final question, I just want to thank you for joining us this evening, and congratulations on the launch of Lambton Men here in the U.S.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
Oh, it's been an absolute delight on this end as well. In, I guess, about 30 minutes, we will be also having Daniel Silva on the Crowdcast event hosted by HarperCollins. So if you've gotten an invite to that, make sure to tune in. Tomorrow night, we'll be back with Jim Butcher. And every night for the next couple weeks, we'll have someone.
You are busy.
We are busy, but it's great. It's great. We're not, I mean, we might as well be talking to the people we want to talk to. So just a little store update. We are still currently closed to the public, but we are doing contactless curbside pickup as well as mail orders And we'd love nothing more than for you to call and ask us what our favorite books are. We love recommending over the phone, and we can get you taken care of that way. So to close our evening discussion, what is your idea of perfect happiness?
Oh, well, I'm sure this isn't going to be a very original answer, but it is being with my family and my cat. And I think this time has kind of taught us that. So I think if I was to be really greedy, I would say it's to be with my family in Italy. To be in Italy in a lovely summer's evening and that beautiful smell of Italy with my husband and our 2 children and my cat who would be spirited there, and a nice glass of wine.
It sounds delightful. Again, we have signed book plates. If you're interested in any of Elly's books, we'll get those to you. We have Stranger Diaries, Lambton Men. We also have the first in the Ruth Galloway series, Crossing Places, in stock, as well as A Girl Called Justice. So hopefully you'll consider getting one of those. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again to Elly. And good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.